With the end of the 3.3 story that effectively concludes the Lahairoi saga, we got a lot of content and also lore. And one thing I focused on in regards to plot was how much the patch revealed a lot about the plans and mentality of the Grand Architect. When I was streaming my playthrough for the game and we got to the part where Navora makes a whole spiel about how they will save the world, one of my chatters said that they thought that the Grand Architect's vision and method wasn't actually wrong. And while that sounds really concerning on the surface, I think there is some merit to that assertion. Because if you look at it from a certain perspective, they aren't wrong. There's a bit of relativism at play here, and that's what I really want to talk about in today's video. Because I think it's one of the most fascinating parts of the 3.3 story. So just be aware that there will be spoilers for the story, of course, and without any further ado, let's get started. To preface, we need to discuss what the Grand Architect actually wants. In short, the Grand Architect wants to weaponize the Lament, and particularly Frenodians against themselves, to force an advancement for humanity by tapping into a kind of immoral, yet extraordinarily immense pool of power. That's why it seems like they've been assisting Frenodians to fight you across Jinzhou, Renacita, and now Lahairoi. They aren't actually doing it just to be villains for the sake of being villains, but because they want to find a way to weaponize Frenodians to give humanity power. This is the argument that the Grand Architect presents to Hiyuki. If we want to truly move past the suffering of the Lament, we need to tap into the power of Frenodian resonators, people that can use the power that has caused them so much suffering. Mia and Denia were failures, and Cardathea was so perfect that someone like her could never be created ever again. Hiyuki, however, had the potential to actually contain and utilize a Frenodian as well as a Sentinel's power, which she could use to hypothetically help humanity survive, which is why the Grand Architect wanted to get her on their side. I suspect that this is actually the reason why they wanted to recruit Galbrenna as well, as she can eat Tacit Discords and actually also shows that she can absorb the Frenodian Leviathan. While the promise of weaponizing a Frenodian, a source of humanity's suffering to prevent more suffering, sounds detestable, I think the more scary thing is that we can't definitively say that the Grand Architect is wrong. If we look at it from a purely logical and rational perspective, they are trying to save humanity and minimize as much human suffering in the long term by giving humanity more power at whatever the cost. The Grand Architect keeps emphasizing that they are saving lives, keeping people alive, that dead people can't feel pride or dignity. When you see the efforts that the GA is making to weaponize Frenodians to give humanity a real chance, given the empirical evidence that Rover, Cardathea, and Denia show that actually, yes, it is possible for humans to weaponize a Frenodian's power for their own aims to benefit humanity, then we're faced with a rather uncomfortable truth. When we compare this option with the continued failure and impossibility of Rover's 1,000-year approach to fight against the Lament, the Grand Architect's approach has a logically higher chance of success than Rover's by far. From Mia to Denia, and now at the end of the story, probably even mass manufacturing Frenodian vessels, FRXETH's efforts of what they are trying to achieve are getting more and more successful. However, for all of the Grand Architect glazing that we just did, their position isn't without flaws. For one, we can't fully trust Frenodians or their powers. If you've watched some of my other videos, you would know that we've talked quite a lot about Stanislaw Lem's novel Solaris, one of the most critical influences for the world of Wuthering Waves, Solaris 3, something which Kuro have de facto confirmed themselves. The novel's most prominent lessons is exposing the egotistical faults of anthropocentrism, that the belief that humans are at the center of existence, that everything must conform to a human understanding, is assumptive and wrong. The Grand Architect, despite how apathetic they are to death and human lives, is quite anthropocentric. They are manipulating the divine, gods themselves, in order to try advance humanity and ditch the failed sentinels. However, Stanislaw Lem in his novel presents the flaws of this way of thinking. When we face especially something alien, something intrinsically inhuman, when we are facing something like the Lament, something like Frenodians, it is functionally impossible to conform them to a human frame of understanding. Rover and the Grand Architect don't know the solution and the truth of the Lament or the Frenodians. Otherwise, they would have defeated them already, because they share the same end goal. The Grand Architect is pushing forward dangerous methods based on empirical rather than objective or scientific evidence, and we have no idea that Frenodians will actually be capable of being utilized for their power, even if the FRXETH's experiments are showing promising results. The second issue with the Grand Architect's methods is that they are kind of the equivalent of selling one's soul to the devil for power. They're using Frenodians, the cause of human suffering, to save future people from more suffering. It's a really Faustian, Machiavellian approach where the FRXETHs believe that the ends always justify the means. They disregard human morals and dignity and make immense sacrifices on the premise that they are saving more lives in the long run. I think in order to highlight how problematic this methodology is, you only need to think about the belief system of the Frenodian Leviathan, which was based on a social treatise by Thomas Hobbes of the same name, which I have talked about a lot extensively here. Essentially, Hobbes believed that in order to create a perfect society free from violence, bloodshed, and conflict, people would need to be absolutely controlled. They should basically have no freedom or agency at all. Wuthering Waves' Leviathan takes this a step further. In crafting its conception of paradise, its people would be frozen and preserved as statues in order to craft a heaven free from violence, pain, and suffering. They even say it themselves.
Mortals must follow a uniform creed, lest they descend into chaos. Mortals must seek the solace of faith, lest they crumble beneath calamity. Under my guidance, Raguna will know no tears. The people shall rejoice eternal. Sacrifice and pain will be no more. Isn't a world like this wonderful?
In Leviathan's conception of paradise, its subjects would be able to stay alive and live in peace forever, saving as many lives as possible from suffering. Yet, if the Grand Architect is correct and the ends justify the means, then why do we look at Leviathan's vision of the world as horrifying? It's because they don't. While Rover and the Blackshaws aren't immune from making mistakes and sacrifices of their own, it's because they believe that, no, the ends do not necessarily justify the means, that they seem to stand diametrically opposed to the Grand Architect and the FRXETHs. While they currently have a lower chance of success compared to their adversaries, Rover's camp prioritizes the morality, dignity, and respect that makes up the spirit of humanity. What's fascinating is that in one of Shorekeeper's character stories, she questions Rover on this very logical fallacy. Humans are not bound by restrictions. The freedom to choose is more important than any answer. Humanity isn't just data or abstract concepts that must be calculated to maximize survival outcomes. Because while the Grand Architect argues that they are maximizing the eventual survival of more lives and humanity, the steps they needed to take to get there go against the spirit of humanity entirely. No one would want to survive and live in Leviathan's paradise. So why would you also be able to live with yourself after you sold your soul to the devil? If you were to corrupt yourself to use Frenodians, the cause of your suffering in the first place, for the sake of survival, would you have gained a life that would be worth living? It's a difficult question that can be seen from multiple perspectives, and that's why the FRXETH exists as an organization in the first place. If people didn't think this way, their existence would be moot. Within 3.3 though, we saw that sometimes sacrifice, a conscious disregard for your own life, of suffering on purpose, is not inherently wrong. The Explorer's cutscene, which was basically one of the best in the entire story, was one that emphasized the spirit of humanity. That even if Rover and the others are fighting against an eternal night, a lament that is seemingly impossible to defeat, the hope that it can be defeated while staying true to your values is essentially the spirit of humanity made manifest. And when we see that the FRXETH is opposed to this approach, believing that caring about these things will cause more suffering and lives lost in the long run, we get dialogues like the one from Cristoforo in 2.7, where he says that Rover's methods will never work, that it will cause people to live lives of inevitable suffering, that being radical and breaking the rules of the game is the only way to progress. And like what I said all the way back in 2.7, I think the philosophy of Albert Camus is very useful for exploring this discrepancy in perspective. Cristoforo and the Grand Architect believe that Rover's methods will only result in lives soaked in inevitable suffering, and that Rover's beliefs of the spirit of humanity in spite of this are pointless. Camus posits the question that, if life is full of inevitable suffering, what is the point of living? The answer, Camus argues, is the same as that of Rover. Even if life is cruel, and the lament is so impossible to defeat that it seems meaningless to fight against it, the one thing we have control of is to live passionately and, in a way, be true to ourselves, to refuse to be crushed by despair. You may have heard of one of Camus' most famous quotes: "We must imagine Sisyphus happy." Human existence is like that of Sisyphus. Cristoforo presents our lives as one of unavoidable suffering. Yet, when Sisyphus continues to push his boulder up the mountain, even if it is useless, he has truly mastered his fate. He has refused to fall to despair and stay true to himself. And in the face of a calamity like the lament, which, being impossible to solve, is really a Sisyphean tragedy, we can't assuredly say that the Grand Architect or Rover is right. But what do you think? If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing or supporting me by donating or becoming a channel member. I'll be pretty busy bringing out a Hiyuki video after this one, so I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you all in the next one.